Long Voyage Back, page 380, the penultimate edition. After burying Frank at sea, they sailed on. They kept Vagabond well off the Brazilian coast, hoping to reduce the chance of being attacked by another plane or gunboat, their destination still being uncertain. As long as food and water held out, they would continue into the South Atlantic. Everything they were hearing from around the world encouraged them to try land. The plague was still spreading. Shortwave transmissions from all over Europe had ceased. Most US broadcasters shut down. An AM station in Uruguay reported that a series of food riots in Rio de Janeiro had been suppressed by the army and left over 3,000 people dead. And the Brazilian Air Force had attacked and sunk a freighter crammed with refugees that had tried, after repeated warnings to turn back, to enter the harbour at Rio de Janeiro. Rio was staggering under the impact of unemployed and starving millions, who were begging, stealing, rioting, and fleeing to and arriving from all over Brazil. Thousands had died in the last month from disease or starvation, many from the newly introduced plague. But the alternatives to landing in Brazil were equally dismal. The few small islands in the South Atlantic were governed by Brazil or Argentina, and their friendliness to American refugees was as doubtful as that of the mainland. Argentina, because it hadn't needed to export food, seemed slightly preferable. But the last Spanish-language broadcast that Sheila had been able to understand before their transistor radio batteries went dead had indicated that illegal immigrants were being quarantined and put in internment camps, a gloomy prospect unless and until they actually began to starve to death. In the meantime, they would sail south, hoping that the plague would run its course on land and would not reappear on Vagabond, hope that they could feed themselves from the sea and wait. In 11 days they reached the latitude of Rio, passing 100 miles to the east. Their tentative destination was the coast below Mar del Plata, 250 miles southeast of Buenos Aires in Argentina. When their shortwave radio broke down, they were left without a functioning radio. They began sailing alone amidst the depressing silence from the rest of the world. And the sea too seemed silent and empty. They saw no other ships. No seabirds accompanied them. Although they trolled all the time, usually with 2 rods and 2 lures, the fish, if they were there, usually spurned their offerings. As they grew weaker from increasingly strict rationing, they began to dip into their emergency food kit. They established a schedule of rationing that would permit them to reach southern Argentine with an empty larder. But Vagabond sailed now in peace. Their harmony was not simply the result of the lassitude brought on by malnutrition, but rather the trust and affection that had been forged out of their common experience of the horrors of the previous 2.5 months. Neil and Jean were lovers, husband and wife. So too were Jim and Lisa, although Lisa still had not fully recovered from the disease and was barely able to walk. Sheila and Philip were their benevolent aunt and uncle, Ollie the grandpa. Neil lived with Jean and Skippy in her port cabin. The Wellingtons had taken over his aft cabin. He slowly recovered his strength. At first Neil and Jean had thought that his quiet dignity was only weakness, the after effects of the disease, but soon they realised that with death so near, Jim had found the same tranquility that Frank had come to during his last hours. He had developed a new low-key sense of humour and was no longer in awe of Neil, but able to poke fun at him. Lisa, although the disease had left her pathetically weak, was childlike in the joy she showed in being alive and in love with Jim. Each morning he carried her from their starboard cabin to the open cockpit areas where she could be with the others. Neil urged books upon her. Skippy urged her to play games with him. Philip began to teach her navigation. She did a little of each. Although her weakness was sometimes heartrending, they had no idea how completely she might ever eventually recover. The joy she found in Jim, her happiness in living, made it impossible to be depressed in her presence. But as they moved further south, they were also moving into the late winter of the southern hemisphere. They were pitifully unprepared for the cold, especially after having just suffered through 2 weeks at the equator. Their bodies were lacking in fat that could be burned off to warm them. There was little winter clothing aboard. With the propane supply exhausted and their kerosene almost gone, they had no fuel to warm the cabins, and the 3 women took the 2 wool blankets aboard and began to convert them into warm clothing. The only cold weather gear that they had was Neil's orange float suit, and they needed 2 or 3 additional winter garments so that at least 3 people could be out on deck at once if necessary. They cut and sewed 1 small woolen jumpsuit to fit Lisa and Sheila, and another larger one to fit Jim, Neil and Philip. From the remains of the blankets they were able to make a 3rd jacket to fit Ollie and Jean. 2 pairs of sweatpants became winter underwear. Clothing was no longer individual, but held in common by 2 or 3 similarly built individuals, and wore as the need arose. They were now without soap, so their clothing began to stink and their limited number of socks to disintegrate. The strangeness of their clothing was only another symptom of their disassociation from their previous lives. Just as they were physically, electronically, and geographically isolated from most of the rest of the planet, so too they were now in some way detached from the incredible events that had transformed the Earth. The fear and hatred that the inhabitants of the South Hemisphere felt for refugees like themselves seemed to be natural and as blameless as the squalls that afflicted them from north of the equator. Something to read for. The destruction of much of the world by nuclear war seemed like a natural tragedy, as if the Earth had been hit by some errant comet. The plague did not reappear. After 2 weeks they dared to assume that they were free of that danger. They were healthy. They were starving. Bringing in a single fish was the cause for a major celebration. The loss of a hooked fish before they had boarded it left them limp, empty, afraid. When their emergency cache food was mostly gone, when they were down to a few days' rations of dried fish, when all of their previous stores of food were reduced to a few rotting potatoes and the last unopened, rusted can of spam, they turned, filled with dread, again towards land. Their lives, which for 3 weeks had taken on a peaceful, dreamlike quality brought about by their isolation and undernourishment, now, they feared, would once again take on the quality of a nightmare. They approached land feeling like aliens about to visit a foreign planet. But the land came out to them. An Argentine frigate met them 30 miles off the coast and warned them through an electronic bullhorn that no North Americanos were being allowed on the mainland of Argentina. If they came any closer to the coast, their boat would be confiscated. They would be taken to the recently conquered Malvinas Islands with the other plague victims and illegal immigrants. They turned back out to sea. Now sailing south seemed like an act of madness. They were sailing into winter, down towards the fiercest winds in the world, to the Straits of Magellan, to Cape Horn. They were sailing down to the very bottom of the civilized world, to a land so barren and infertile only the simplest and most impoverished Indian cultures had inhabited it until barely a century ago. They were sailing away from man. They had decided to try to sail through the Straits of Magellan to the Pacific. This proposal, which would have seemed so absurd, so impossible 2 months ago, seemed to all of them now to be inevitable and necessary. They had been driven south by forces beyond their control. Every time they had stopped running and tried to sail, they had been driven onward. Although the rest of the planet was silent now, all their radio was silent, they sensed that where men were few and far from the Holocaust, there peace might be found. To get to the islands of the South Pacific, they would have to round the tip of South America. So they would round it. Strangely, even as they turned away from land, the sea began again to feed them. They caught 2 large tuna, 30 pounds between them, at dusk on the very day that they had been repulsed. They decided now to hold none of this blessing back, because they knew that all of them were near the end of their tethers. They decided to eat as if there was no tomorrow. The good Lord will provide, Ollie pronounced. Occasionally. Watches had to be shortened to 2 hours, sometimes only 1, because no one had the strength to stay at the helm any longer. Each person slept most of the time they weren't needed in sailing the boat. Carpets, life preservers and unused sails were used as extra blankets. As they moved further south, the seas grew bigger, the winds grew fierce. Neil, fighting to bring down the mainsail in the sudden 40-knot winds, wrenched his back, sending it into spasms and effectively incapacitating him. As the cold became worse and the work even more demanding, Ollie too took to bed. After standing his watch one morning, he staggered down into the main cabin and fainted. Later, revived, he announced he was feeling poorly and would prefer a vacation. With Neil already bedridden, Ollie's dereliction made everyone realise how frail and bony he had become. A laughing skeleton. Philip had called him a few days earlier. He had a slight fever, complained of pains in his chest and belly, complained of a toothache, but what really ailed him couldn't be pinned down. His illness left Jim and the 2 women to sail Vagabond alone. Thus now Jean and Sheila each had to take 2-hour shifts at the helm alone in 30 to 40-knot winds, and Vagabond, scarred and jury-rigged, as tired in their bones as her sailors in theirs, slashed and pounded dutifully forward, her sails tearing much more often, fittings becoming loose, but still going forward. When they finally arrived at Cabo Virginis, at the eastern end of the Straits. They arrived, as Philip had predicted, in a gale. It blew out their working jib. They lost a halyard up the mast. They were almost blown onto a rocky shore before they regained control and retreated back out the strait to anchor in the lee of a point. They had to remain anchored there for 4 days, waiting for the gale to blow itself out. They mended sail, caught half dozen small tasty fish on the bottom, and rested. They sent a party ashore to search for food. The shore was barren, windswept, all in grey and brown. They felt immense relief that there were no humans in the area. The late winter early spring season meant that there were no green vegetation except in the water. They plucked at the few dried berries they found as the most luscious of strawberries. Dried grasses were picked to be their lettuce. Seaweed and shellfish were gathered from the tidal pools. Thankful for these meagre winter remnants, the party returned to Vagabond to rest, Ollie joining the Wellingtons to conserve body warmth in the after cabin. Neil, although still bedridden and frustrated by being unable to share in the sailing, nevertheless found himself strangely content. Instead of feeling alone and isolated, he felt as if he were at home surrounded by a loving family. Jean had sawed a hole in the wall separating their cabin from the main cabin, so he was able to talk to the others. He had once or twice tried shouting orders from his bunk, but even as he did, he realised his contributions weren't needed. Philip and Sheila and Jim were all good sailors. Instead of making him feel unneeded, this awareness of his own superfluity was soothing. He could lie in his berth without the sense that unless he got up on the deck in the bitter cold, Vagabond was doomed. The only thing that occasionally frightened him about his contentment was that it might be a sign that he was dying. His own survival had given him hope for the group as well. He felt that down so far at the bottom of the world, the disease called man might have escaped the fear and violence that was destroying the more civilised strains up north. Ultimately, he supposed, his feeling that they were going to make it was as absurd and groundless as his and Jean's early conviction that they were doomed. Deep down, he knew that even now, after all they'd been through, death could squash them all effortlessly with just one casual blow. Yet for now they still lived, and despite the hardships they found in the tiny haven of their cabin, a quiet and confident happiness that had always eluded Neil. Life was reduced to eating, keeping warm, and companionship. The violent conflicts that racked the rest of mankind seemed distant and trivial. A conversation between Neil and Jean one afternoon when Vagabond was at anchor, riding out the snow squalls and 40-knot winds, showed how detached they had become from their precious world. They were lying under a pile of covers in their berth. "You know," Neil said to Jean, "I've been thinking about how the war started." He paused as if he was still thinking about it, and then went on. "I'm not sure that the Russians fired the first salvo of missiles." Holding his hand as she lay beside him, Jean turned to look at him in the grey light of the afternoon. "You believe those Venezuelan broadcasts?" she asked, referring to programmes they'd listened to more than a month earlier in which the Venezuelan spokesman had charged that the US had started the war. "No, not that," Neil replied. "The thing that's always bothered me is that the Russians attacked American cities and industries and military bases. We're told they attacked missile sites too, but one station way back at the beginning said something that I've never forgotten. They suggested that people flee to North and South Dakota to escape the fallout." Jean watched him as he paused, holding his gaze and waiting. "I can't help concluding that if the Russians didn't hit South Dakota, it was because they knew there was nothing there to hit. All our missiles had already been fired." "If the Russians had struck first," Jean prompted, "South Dakota would have been the primary target." "Yes." "So you think that the President gave the orders for a surprise attack?" she said quietly. "He wanted his nation to survive," Neil replied. "He thought it was sit and get clobbered or strike first. He ordered the first strike for the same reason that a Russian premier would have done it, out of fear that the enemy was desperate enough to do it, so he'd better do it first." Jean felt a distant sadness. She hadn't really questioned the assumption of all the American radio stations that the Russians had struck first. She realised that she felt it was only natural that they would do it. Americans had been fearing that they would be attacked for years. Yet she understood that very fear, so pervasive, so hopeless, might have led an American government to do what Neil was speculating it had done. She felt no anger, only the distant sadness. "The missiles fired at South Dakota targets might have been intercepted," she suggested, "or might have missed on the first strike. And then, after our Dakota-based missiles had been fired, the Russians left the area alone." Even as she spoke, most of her mind was accepting Neil's thesis. "Yes, that's possible," agreed Neil. "I'd thought of that. But we know the very first Soviet missiles hit American cities, targets that would always be vulnerable, whereas missile silos are worth hitting only on the very first strike before they've launched their missiles." Jean looked at him. "How does it make you feel?" she asked. Doesn't make me feel much one way or the other, I replied. It doesn't change how hungry I am, he smiled. The two sides had gotten each other into a position where sooner or later someone was going to hit first. The fact that our government may have been the first to give in to that fear doesn't really horrify me. The mistakes had already been made. Jean stared out the cabin window as most of the horizontal line of snowflakes rushed past. No wonder we're outcasts. And later that same afternoon their talk brought them to a subject that gave them new vitality. When Neil, still huddled under the covers with Jean, had first discussed Lisa's continuing weakness, he had expressed concern that Lisa might be pregnant, which, because of the fetus's development, might have been impaired by a high fever, which would put an added strain on her health. Jean responded that Lisa had a regular period a few days before the plague struck her, and then, looking puzzled, suddenly looked with a flushed joy at Neil. "What are you thinking?" Neil asked, aware of something special happening with her. "I just realised that I may be pregnant," she said to him, looking half joyful and half odd. Neil felt stunned. Their love-making had usually been an end-of-the-world desperation that was outside normal everyday reality. Pregnancy belonged to the old world, not the ugly, tenuous one they were now inhabited. "My period's overdue," Jean went on, now looking uncertain. "I suppose it might just be my wound, my worrying diet." She frowned as she considered these other explanations, but then she smiled again. She and Neil had made love without contraception during her most fertile time. In those days, the possible consequences seemed irrelevant. Now they seemed divine. "Shut up there!" Even the shadow of the possible effects of her exposure to radiation didn't dim her joy. "Love-making does tend to create babies, I suppose," Neil said to her, still somewhat dazed, with a grin on his face. "Oh, Neil, I hope so, I hope so, I hope so," Jean said, hugging him. Bright-eyed, he looked down at her, and then off through the window at the snow swirling past. He had a boyishly happy, faraway expression. "Now we will have to live," he said dreamily, "just to see if it's a boy or a girl." But an hour later, as he struggled upon deck for the first time in a week, he knew that his puny aspirations would have been nothing to do with it. Their lives... Oh, for God's sake, Bear! An hour later, as he struggled upon deck for the first time in a week, he knew that his puny aspirations would have nothing to do with it. Their lives, even the new one growing within Jean, still hung by a thread. And that's the end of the penultimate part of Long Voyage Back. Join us all next Friday when we do the last 7 pages of what is probably the second best classic Cold War nuclear fiction book I've ever read. I still think Alas Babylon is definitely the best I've ever read, but this is a close second. And it's been a long project for me, and a long project for you guys, and for those people who've been tuning in week after week. And I apologise for the absences. This takes a lot of work, more than anything else I've ever done on YouTube. I appreciate it. So join me next Friday for the last 7 pages of Rheinhart's 1983, A Long Voyage Back. And we're going to have a party of sorts. Thank you all.